Picture this. You're standing beside your great-aunt's casket, mascara streaking down your cheeks, when your husband of 18 years leans over and whispers, "I can't do this anymore, Linda. I'm leaving." Then he actually walks out of the funeral home, leaving you there with two confused teenagers and a room full of mourners staring in shock. That was my Tuesday. But what David didn't know was that in exactly 48 hours, I'd be sitting across from him in a lawyer's office, watching his face turn white as Margaret Whitmore's will was read aloud, revealing that I'd just inherited a multi-million-dollar funeral home empire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Linda Harper, and until 3 days ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was. A devoted wife to David, mother to Tyler and Chloe, former social worker turned suburban homemaker in the quaint town of Millbrook, Connecticut. Our colonial-style house sat on Maple Street, complete with white picket fence and flower boxes that I tended every morning before the kids woke up. David commuted to Hartford daily for his job at Premier Insurance Group, where he'd climbed steadily up the corporate ladder for the past decade. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. David made decent money, enough for family vacations to the Cape each summer, and private music lessons for Chloe's violin. Tyler played varsity soccer, and we never missed a game. Sunday dinners at the country club, PTA meetings, book clubs. I'd built what I thought was a perfect life around supporting my family's dreams and ambitions. The only unusual element in our ordinary existence was my great-aunt Margaret Whitmore. She'd been something of a family legend, the eccentric relative who'd never married, and instead poured her energy into building Whitmore and Associates Funeral, homes from a single location in Millbrook into a respected chain spanning 6 Connecticut towns. Margaret was sharp as a tack, even at 87, with steel gray hair always perfectly styled, and an uncanny ability to comfort grieving families, while running her business with the precision of a Swiss watch. David had always been uncomfortable around Margaret. He'd make excuses to skip family gatherings where she'd be present, claiming work obligations or sudden headaches. When I'd visit her alone, bringing homemade cookies or just sitting in her Victorian mansion's parlor sharing tea, David would later ask pointed questions about what we'd discussed. Did she mention money? Had she said anything about her business? I'd always brushed off his curiosity as natural interest in family matters. Margaret and I had grown closer over the past 5 years, especially after David's mother passed away. She'd become the grandmother figure my children had lost, teaching Tyler chess and encouraging Chloe's artistic pursuits. She'd even offered to pay for art school when the time came, though David had quickly declined, saying we could handle our own children's education expenses. 3 weeks ago, Margaret had called me with unusual urgency in her voice. She needed to update some important paperwork and wanted me to drive over that afternoon. When I arrived at her mansion on Elm Street, she seemed more fragile than usual, though her mind remained razor-sharp. We'd spent 2 hours in her study, surrounded by decades of business documents and family photographs, while she explained various legal matters she wanted me to understand. Margaret had always been private about her wealth, but that afternoon she'd been surprisingly forthcoming. The funeral home business had been incredibly lucrative, she'd explained. People would always need dignified services for their loved ones, and she'd built a reputation for excellence that commanded premium prices. Whitmore and Associates handled nearly 60% of all funerals in central Connecticut, with waiting lists for their services. She'd also mentioned feeling disappointed in some family members who'd only reached out when they needed money. Her nephews on her father's side had borrowed repeatedly over the years, never repaying loans and rarely visiting unless they wanted something. She'd grown tired of being treated like a personal bank rather than family. That conversation had stayed with me as David's behavior became increasingly strange over the following weeks. He'd started staying late at the office more frequently, claiming big projects and important client meetings. When I'd suggest we visit Margaret together, He'd find reasons to postpone. He'd also become oddly interested in our household finances, questioning purchases I'd made and suggesting we needed to be more careful with spending. The night before Margaret's funeral, David had been particularly distant. While I'd been ironing my black dress and helping the kids choose appropriate clothing, he'd been on his phone constantly, stepping outside for what he claimed were work calls. When Tyler asked if we could all sit together at the service, David had snapped that funerals weren't social events and we needed to pay proper respects, not treat it like family gathering time. I'd found his response strange, considering Margaret was my family, not his, and she'd always welcomed him warmly despite his obvious discomfort. But grief affects people differently, I'd reasoned. Maybe David was dealing with his own complicated feelings about loss and mortality. The morning of the funeral arrived gray and drizzling, typical October weather in Connecticut. Margaret's service was being held at Riverside Memorial Chapel, one of her own funeral homes, which somehow felt fitting. She'd always taken pride in the elegant interior design, the comfortable seating, and the sound system that allowed even whispered eulogies to be heard clearly throughout the chapel. Patricia Wells, who'd managed Riverside for 15 years, had personally overseen every detail of Margaret's arrangements. The casket was surrounded by magnificent flower arrangements, including a stunning display of white orchids from an anonymous sender. Classical music played softly as family and friends gathered to honor a woman who'd touched countless lives through her compassion during their darkest moments. I'd expected maybe 50 people, but the chapel filled beyond capacity. Business associates, employees from all 6 funeral homes, families Margaret had served over the decades, community leaders, and distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. She'd clearly meant more to our community than I'd fully understood. David sat beside me during the first portion of the service, but his leg bounced nervously and he kept checking his phone despite having it on silent mode. Tyler and Chloe flanked us, both handling the solemnity better than their father. When Pastor Williams invited anyone who wanted to share memories to come forward, I'd planned to speak about Margaret's kindness and wisdom. As I stood to approach the podium, David grabbed my wrist. "Do you really need to do this?" He'd whispered urgently. "Can't you just let others talk?" His grip was surprisingly tight, and something in his expression made me pause. He looked almost panicked, which made no sense. Margaret had loved me, and sharing fond memories was exactly what funeral services were for. I'd gently pulled free and walked to the front, where I'd spoken about Margaret's generous spirit, her business acumen, and the way she'd made everyone feel valued and heard. I'd mentioned how she'd taught Tyler to play chess and encouraged Chloe's art, how she'd been a constant source of wisdom and support. The audience had nodded and smiled, clearly recognizing the woman I was describing. When I'd returned to my seat, David was gone. Tyler whispered that he'd stepped outside to take a call, but 20 minutes passed without his return. Other speakers shared their memories, each painting a picture of Margaret as someone who'd lived with purpose and integrity. James Reed, her business partner, spoke movingly about her vision for treating death with dignity and beauty rather than fear. As the service concluded and we prepared to move to Oakwood Cemetery for the burial, David finally reappeared. His face was flushed, and he seemed agitated in a way that went beyond normal grief. When I'd asked where he'd been, he'd muttered something about an emergency at work that couldn't wait. The burial service was smaller, just immediate family, and closest friends gathering around Margaret's gravesite under a canopy that protected us from the light rain. Pastor Williams offered final prayers, and we each placed a white rose on the casket as it was lowered into the ground beside the plot where Margaret's parents rested. That's when it happened. As family members began sharing final hugs and making plans to gather at Margaret's house for a reception, David approached me with an expression I'd never seen before. His usual confident demeanor had vanished, replaced by something that looked almost like desperation mixed with resolve. "Linda, I need to tell you something," he'd said, his voice low but audible to Tyler and Chloe standing nearby. "I can't pretend anymore. This whole life, this marriage, it's not working for me. I'd stared at him in confusion, thinking grief was making him say irrational things. David, this isn't the time or place. We're at Margaret's burial. Can we discuss whatever's bothering you when we get home? No, he'd continued, his voice getting louder. I'm done waiting for the right time. There's never going to be a right time. I can't do this anymore, Linda. I'm leaving. The words had hit me like physical blows. Leaving? What do you mean leaving? Around us, conversations had stopped as relatives and friends began to notice our exchange. I mean, I'm done with this marriage, with this life, with pretending to be happy in Millbrook playing house. I've been miserable for years, and I'm finally admitting it. Tyler had stepped closer, his face pale with shock. Dad? What are you talking about? We just buried Great-Aunt Margaret. This is crazy. It's not crazy, David had replied, his voice taking on a cruel edge I'd never heard before. It's honest. Your mother has spent so much time focusing on everyone else's problems, she never noticed that her own husband was drowning. The accusation had been so unexpected, so vicious, that I'd actually staggered backward. Chloe had begun crying, and several family members had moved closer, clearly uncomfortable but unsure whether to intervene. David, please, I'd begged, my voice breaking. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it. We can get counseling, take a vacation. Anything you need. But not here. Not now. Please don't do this in front of the children at Margaret's funeral. His response had shattered what remained of my composure. I'm not discussing this further, Linda. I've made my decision. I'll be staying elsewhere for the foreseeable future. We'll figure out the details later. And then he'd walked away. Actually walked away from his family at a funeral, leaving me standing beside Margaret's grave with 2 devastated teenagers and 20 shocked relatives watching in horror. Patricia Wells had immediately stepped forward, her professional composure intact despite the unprecedented drama. Mrs. Harper, why don't we get you and the children somewhere private to collect yourselves? The reception can wait. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My sister Janet had driven down from Boston for the funeral and quickly took charge, gathering Tyler and Chloe while I stood frozen in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. 18 years of marriage couldn't end with a 30-second declaration at a graveside. David couldn't actually abandon his family at his wife's great-aunt's funeral, but he had. By the time we'd reached Margaret's house for what should have been a gathering to celebrate her life and share comfort with each other, David was nowhere to be found. His car was gone from the funeral home parking lot. His phone went straight to voicemail. As relatives awkwardly navigated the reception, making conversation while pretending they hadn't just witnessed my marriage implode beside a fresh grave, I'd moved through Margaret's house like a sleepwalker. The same parlor where we'd shared tea and conversation just weeks earlier now felt like a museum, preserved exactly as she'd left it, but somehow empty of her presence. Frank Morrison, Margaret's longtime attorney, had approached me near the end of the reception. Mrs. Harper, I'm terribly sorry for your loss and for what happened today. Margaret thought the world of you, you know. She mentioned you frequently in our meetings over the years. I'd thanked him numbly, still processing the surreal turn my life had taken. One moment I'd been a married woman mourning her beloved relative. The next I was apparently separated with no warning or explanation. There is one matter we'll need to discuss soon, Frank had continued gently. Margaret's will needs to be read, and there are some provisions that require immediate attention. Would you be available tomorrow afternoon? I realize the timing isn't ideal given today's events. Of course, I'd replied, though I couldn't imagine what provisions would require my immediate attention. Margaret had been generous over the years with birthday gifts and holiday presents, but I'd never expected to inherit anything significant from her estate. Frank had handed me his business card and squeezed my shoulder sympathetically. 2 o'clock. At my office, if that works. And Mrs. Harper? Margaret was very specific about who should be present for the reading. She requested that your husband attend as well. The irony wasn't lost on me. The husband who'd abandoned me at Margaret's funeral was apparently required to attend the reading of her will the following day. As guests gradually departed and Janet helped me clean up, I'd found myself alone in Margaret's study where we'd had our last serious conversation. The room still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume, and her reading glasses sat folded on the massive oak desk where she'd managed her business empire for decades. Looking around at the framed photographs, covering every surface, I'd realized how little I truly knew about Margaret's life. Pictures of her as a young woman, business documents dating back 50 years, awards from professional organizations, thank you letters from families she'd served. She'd built something substantial and lasting, touching countless lives while creating financial security for herself. That night, as Tyler and Chloe processed their father's shocking abandonment, and I tried to make sense of my suddenly uncertain future, I had no idea that Margaret's final gift to me would be the key to everything. I couldn't have imagined that. David's cruelest betrayal would accidentally position me for the most empowering moment of my life. All I knew was that my comfortable, predictable existence had shattered in a single afternoon, leaving me to pick up pieces I didn't even recognize while wondering how I'd failed to see the cracks forming in my marriage. Tomorrow's meeting with Frank Morrison would change everything, though I had no way of knowing it yet. Margaret had always been full of surprises, but her last one would be the most shocking of all. The morning after Margaret's funeral dawned crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the previous day's drizzle and the storm raging in my personal life. I'd barely slept, alternating between replaying David's cruel words at the graveside and trying to understand how 18 years of marriage could disintegrate so suddenly. Tyler had knocked on my bedroom door at dawn, unable to sleep either, and we'd sat together in the kitchen making pancakes neither of us really wanted to eat. Chloe emerged later, her eyes red from crying, and the three of us had moved through our morning routine like actors in a play we'd never rehearsed. How do you explain to your children that their father abandoned them at a funeral? How do you maintain any sense of normalcy when your foundation has cracked beyond recognition? David still hadn't returned home or answered any of my calls. His silence felt almost more devastating than his initial abandonment, confirming that his decision hadn't been made in a moment of grief-induced madness. This was deliberate, planned, permanent. Around 11 that morning, while I was mechanically sorting through sympathy cards that had arrived for Margaret, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Mrs. Harper? This is Rachel Stevens from Premier Insurance Group. I work with your husband. David in the actuarial department. I'd never heard David mention anyone named Rachel, though his company employed hundreds of people across multiple departments. Yes? Can I help you? Well, this is somewhat awkward, but David didn't come in today and he's missed several important client meetings. His supervisor asked me to call and check if everything's all right. We heard about a family funeral yesterday. The casualness of her inquiry struck me as odd. If David's supervisor was concerned, why wouldn't he call directly? And why would they ask someone from a different department to make the call? I'm sorry, but I don't actually know where David is right now, I'd admitted, the words tasting bitter. We've had some family difficulties following yesterday's funeral. Oh, Rachel had replied, and something in her tone suggested this wasn't entirely surprising news. Well, if you hear from him, could you ask him to call the office? There are some urgent matters that need his attention. After hanging up, I'd stared at the phone with growing unease. David was meticulous about his work responsibilities. In 18 years of marriage, he'd never missed important meetings without advance notice. His career advancement had always been his top priority, sometimes to the detriment of family time. The idea that he'd simply not show up for client meetings was completely out of character, unless something had fundamentally changed about his priorities, unless his career was no longer his primary concern because he'd already made plans that didn't include Premier Insurance Group. I'd spent the next hour calling David's phone repeatedly, each attempt going straight to voicemail. His outgoing message was the same professional greeting he'd used for years, giving no hint of his current mental state or whereabouts. Where? Do you go when you abandon your family? Hotel? Friend's house? Another woman's apartment? That last thought had hit me like a physical blow. Was there someone else? Had David's sudden rejection of our life together been motivated by another relationship? The possibility hadn't occurred to me during yesterday's shock, but now it seemed glaringly obvious. Men didn't typically walk away from comfortable marriages unless they had somewhere else to go. Sitting in our kitchen surrounded by the normal artifacts of family life, school schedules on the refrigerator, Tyler's soccer cleats by the back door, Chloe's violin case on the counter, I'd tried to remember any signs I might have missed. Had there been changes in David's behavior beyond the recent work pressures? Late nights that weren't fully explained? New clothes or cologne? Secretive phone calls? The phone calls. Over the past few months, David had started taking certain calls in private, stepping outside or into his home office and closing the door. When I'd asked about them, he'd always had reasonable explanations. Work crisis, difficult client, confidential company business. I'd never questioned these responses because David had always been trustworthy, and I'd respected his professional privacy. But now those private conversations took on a different significance. How many of them had actually been work-related? How many had been personal calls to someone I'd never met? Around noon, I'd decided to drive to David's office. If he wasn't, answering his phone, maybe confronting him in person would force some kind of explanation. Tyler and Chloe had wanted to come along, desperate for answers about their father's behavior, but I'd convinced them to stay home. Whatever David's reasons for leaving, our children didn't need to witness another public confrontation. Premier Insurance Group occupied a modern glass building in Hartford's business district, the kind of sleek corporate environment David had always thrived in. I'd visited his office numerous times over the years for company parties and family events, so the security guard recognized me and waved me through to the elevator bank. David's department was on the 7th floor, a maze of cubicles and conference rooms where serious-looking people analyzed risk factors and calculated premiums for various insurance policies. I'd always found the work somewhat dry, but David genuinely enjoyed the analytical challenges and the competitive atmosphere. His cubicle was empty, computer dark, desk unusually cluttered with unfinished paperwork. A small succulent plant I'd given him for his birthday last year sat wilted in its pot, clearly neglected for days. Post-it notes covered his monitor with reminders about client calls and project deadlines, all apparently ignored. Mrs. Harper? I'd turned to find a young woman approaching, blonde hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail, wearing a fitted business suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. She was strikingly attractive in a polished, professional way that made me suddenly conscious of my own appearance, my hastily chosen black dress from yesterday's funeral, and my face still puffy from crying. I'm Rachel Stevens. We spoke on the phone this morning. Of course. Rachel from the actuarial department who'd been asked to call about David's absence. Seeing her in person, I'd felt an immediate discomfort that had nothing to do with her friendly smile or professional demeanor. Something about the way she'd approached me, the familiarity in her voice when she'd said my name, suggested she knew more about my situation than a casual work colleague should. I was hoping to find David here, I'd said carefully. Have you seen him today? Rachel had glanced around the office area before responding, as if checking who might be listening. Could we maybe talk somewhere more private? There's a conference room we could use. The suggestion had sent alarm bells ringing in my mind, but I'd followed her to a small meeting room with glass walls and a round table surrounded by ergonomic chairs. Rachel had closed the door and gestured for me to sit, her movements nervous in a way that contradicted her polished exterior. Mrs. Harper, I need to be honest with you about something, and I hope you won't be angry with me for not saying this on the phone. David asked me to call you this morning. He's not actually missing from work. The words had hit me like ice water. He asked you to call me? Yes. He wanted to make sure you believed he was still maintaining his normal routine. He didn't want you to worry about his job security on top of everything else you're dealing with. But that made no sense. If David was concerned about my worrying, why had he abandoned me at a funeral in the first place? Why was he avoiding my calls and refusing to come home? I don't understand, I'd said slowly. If David is at work, where is he? Why won't he answer his phone or talk to me directly? Rachel had looked down at her hands, clearly struggling with whatever she needed to say next. Mrs. Harper, David and I have been seeing each other for about 6 months. I'm sorry you're finding out this way, but he asked me to explain the situation, since he felt unable to face you directly. The conference room had seemed to tilt around me. 6 months. David had been having an affair for 6 months, while I'd been completely oblivious, managing our household and raising our children, and believing we were a happy family. He's staying at my apartment, Rachel had continued, her voice gentle but matter of fact. He wanted me to tell you that he's not coming back to the house. He thinks it would be easier for everyone if you handle the separation through lawyers rather than trying to work things out. Easier for everyone. David couldn't even face his own wife to explain why he was destroying our family, so he'd sent his mistress to deliver the news in a corporate conference room. How long have you known he was married? I'd asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. From the beginning, Rachel had admitted. He was very honest about his situation. He told me he'd been unhappy for years but had stayed because of the children. When we started getting serious, he decided it was time to be honest about what he wanted. What he wanted. Apparently, what David wanted was a younger, more attractive woman who shared his professional interests and didn't come with the complications of teenagers and suburban responsibilities. And yesterday, at the funeral, that was planned? Rachel had nodded reluctantly. He'd been dreading that event for weeks. He said he couldn't pretend to be a devoted husband in front of your family when he was planning to leave. He thought it would be more honest to tell you the truth right away, instead of waiting. More honest. David had justified abandoning his family at a funeral as a form of honesty, as if cruelty delivered quickly was somehow more virtuous than private conversations at home. I'd sat in that sterile conference room listening to my husband's mistress explain his reasoning, and something had shifted inside me. The devastation and confusion of the past 24 hours had crystallized into something colder and more focused. David had calculated this betrayal carefully, planned it methodically, and executed it with stunning selfishness. He'd used me to maintain his comfortable home life while building a relationship with another woman, then discarded me at the most inappropriate moment possible. Does he know about Margaret's will reading this afternoon? I'd asked suddenly. Rachel had looked, confused. Will reading? Margaret Whitmore, my great-aunt who died. Her lawyer wants both David and me present for the reading of her will this afternoon at 2 o'clock. David hadn't mentioned that, Rachel had said, though something in her expression suggested the name Margaret Whitmore wasn't entirely unfamiliar. To her. Well, please tell him he needs to be there. Frank Morrison's office on Main Street in Millbrook. 2 o'clock sharp. I'd stood to leave, my legs surprisingly steady despite the emotional earthquake I'd just experienced. Rachel had seemed surprised by my composure, clearly expecting more drama or pleading. Mrs. Harper, for what it's worth, David does feel terrible about the timing. He knows yesterday was inappropriate. The timing, I'd repeated. Not the betrayal itself, not the lies, not the destruction of our family. Just the timing. Driving home from Hartford, I'd felt oddly detached from my own life. The woman whose husband had just abandoned her at a funeral should be crying or screaming or planning dramatic confrontations. Instead, I'd found myself thinking analytically about David's behavior over the past months, reassessing conversations and incidents through the lens of his deception. The late work meetings that had become more frequent, the new gym membership he'd claimed was for stress relief, the sudden interest in updating his wardrobe, justified as necessary for client meetings. The way he'd started finding fault with small things around the house, criticizing my cooking or suggesting I should exercise more or get my hair styled differently. All of it had been preparation for leaving, making me feel inadequate while building his case for why our marriage wasn't working. He'd been systematically undermining my confidence while building a relationship with Rachel, creating a narrative where I was the boring, demanding wife holding him back from happiness. Back home, Tyler and Chloe had been waiting anxiously for news about their father. I'd told them honestly that David was staying with a colleague and planning to pursue a separation, but I'd spared them the details about his affair. They were dealing with enough trauma without learning that their father had been lying to the entire family for months. The kids had taken the news with the resilience that amazed me about teenagers. They were hurt and angry, but they'd also inherited enough intelligence to recognize that David's behavior said more about his character than about their worth as his children. At 1:30, I'd changed into my most professional outfit, a navy suit I'd worn to job interviews years ago, when I'd briefly considered returning to social work. If Frank Morrison's office was going to be the scene of another awkward encounter with David, I wanted to look composed and confident rather than like a woman whose life had just fallen apart. The law offices of Morrison, Phillips and Associates occupied a renovated Victorian mansion in downtown Millbrook, all dark wood paneling and leather-bound books that conveyed tradition and respectability. Frank Morrison himself was probably in his 70s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of gentle manner that would serve him well in estate planning work. I'd arrived exactly at 2 o'clock to find David already seated in the conference room, wearing a suit I didn't recognize and looking decidedly uncomfortable. He'd avoided making eye contact when I'd entered, focusing instead on papers Frank was organizing at the head of the polished table. "Mrs. Harper, thank you for coming on such short notice," Frank had said warmly. "I realize these past few days have been difficult for your family." David had shifted in his chair at this reference to family difficulties, clearly wondering how much Frank knew about yesterday's events at the funeral. "Now then," Frank had continued, settling into his chair and putting on reading glasses, Margaret Whitmore was very specific about how she wanted her estate handled. She revised her will several times over the past 5 years, with the final version completed just 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. The same timing as my last conversation with Margaret in her study, when she'd seemed so intent on explaining various legal matters. "Margaret's estate is quite substantial," Frank had continued, opening a thick folder. "Whitmore and Associates Funeral Homes currently operates 6 locations across central Connecticut, with real estate holdings, equipment, and business assets valued at approximately $4.2 million. David had straightened in his chair at this figure, suddenly paying much closer attention. I'd known Margaret was successful, but I'd never imagined the scope of her wealth. In addition to the business assets, Frank had continued, Margaret maintained investment portfolios, property holdings, and cash accounts totaling an additional $1.8 million. Her estate, in total, is worth just over $6 million. The numbers had been staggering, but I'd still been wondering why David's presence was required for the reading. Surely Margaret had left us some sentimental keepsake or modest inheritance that required both spouses to be present for legal reasons. Frank had cleared his throat and begun reading from the official document. "To my beloved great-niece Linda Harper, who has shown me more genuine care and affection in recent years than many family members who were only interested in my money, I leave the entirety of Whitmore and Associates Funeral Homes, including all business assets, real estate, equipment, and goodwill." The words had hung in the air like something physical I could touch. The entirety of Whitmore and Associates. 6 funeral homes, $4.2 million in business assets. David's face had gone completely white, his mouth opening and closing, without sound. I'd felt similarly stunned, unable to process the magnitude of what I'd just heard. Furthermore, Frank had continued reading, "To ensure Linda has the resources to maintain and expand the business as she sees fit, I leave her the sum of $1 million in liquid assets, to be transferred immediately upon probate completion, $1 million, in addition to inheriting a multi-million-dollar business empire. The remaining assets of my estate, Frank had read, including investment portfolios and remaining cash accounts, totaling approximately $800,000, I leave to be divided equally among my great-nephews Thomas and Robert Whitmore, with the provision that these funds be used responsibly and not frittered away on poor investments or lifestyle inflation. Frank had set down the will and looked at us over his glasses. There are some additional provisions regarding business, operations, and transition assistance, but those are the primary bequests. Mrs. Harper, congratulations. You're now the sole owner of one of Connecticut's most successful funeral home operations. I'd sat in complete shock, trying to absorb the reality that Margaret had left me everything. Not some sentimental jewelry or small inheritance, but her entire life's work. 6 funeral homes, millions of dollars, financial security beyond anything I'd ever imagined. David had finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. She left Linda everything? The whole business? Frank had nodded calmly. Margaret was very clear about her intentions. She felt Linda would be the best steward of the business she'd spent 50 years building. But what about other family members? David had pressed, his voice gaining strength as the implications sank in. Surely there are relatives with stronger claims to the business. Margaret considered all possibilities very carefully, Frank had replied, with the patient tone of someone who'd dealt with countless estate disputes. Her will is legally sound and reflects her genuine wishes. She spoke often about Linda's character and judgment during our planning sessions. David had turned to stare at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between awe and horror. The wife he'd abandoned yesterday at a funeral had just inherited a fortune beyond either of our dreams. How soon can the business transfer be completed? I'd asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Probate will take a few months, Frank had explained, but Margaret made provisions for immediate operational control. You can begin overseeing the business operations right away, with full legal ownership transferring once the estate is settled. David had continued staring at me with that stunned expression, clearly recalculating everything he thought he knew about our situation. The boring suburban wife he'd discarded had just become a multimillionaire business owner. The comfortable life he'd walked away from had just transformed into something extraordinary. As Frank had explained various practical details about business operations and estate management, I'd found myself thinking about Margaret's final conversation with me in her study. She'd been preparing me for this moment, ensuring I understood the scope of her business empire and the responsibilities that would come with inheriting it. She'd also been observing David carefully over the years, noting his discomfort with her wealth and his obvious interest in her finances whenever the topic arose. Margaret had always been an excellent judge of character, and she'd apparently seen something in David that I'd missed. After Frank had finished explaining the immediate next steps and scheduled follow-up meetings to handle the transition details, David and I had walked out to the parking lot in silence. The October afternoon was crisp and bright, ordinary in every way, except for the extraordinary circumstances that had just reshaped my entire future. Linda, David had said finally, his voice careful and uncertain. This changes things. I'd turned to look at him fully for the first time since he'd abandoned me at Margaret's graveside. Does it? Yesterday you said our marriage was over. You said you'd been miserable for years. Has Margaret's generosity somehow resolved those feelings? David had opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly struggling with how to navigate this unexpected development. Because if you're suddenly interested in reconciliation now that I've inherited millions of dollars, I'd continued, my voice remaining steady, that tells me everything I need to know about why you really left. I'd gotten into my car and driven away, leaving David standing in the parking lot with the wreckage of his carefully laid plans scattered around him like autumn leaves. That evening, sitting in my kitchen while Tyler and Chloe finished their homework upstairs. I'd found myself in the surreal position of being a newly wealthy woman whose husband had just abandoned her for another woman. The contrast was so stark, it would have been laughable if it weren't so personally devastating. Margaret's inheritance hadn't healed the pain of David's betrayal, but it had fundamentally altered the power dynamic between us. Yesterday, I'd been a dependent spouse facing an uncertain financial future. Today, I owned a multi-million-dollar business empire and had liquid assets that would ensure my children's security for life. I'd spent hours going through Margaret's business files that Frank Morrison had provided, trying to understand the scope of what I'd inherited. Whitmore and Associates wasn't just 6 funeral homes. It was a sophisticated operation with steady revenue streams, loyal client relationships, and expansion opportunities Margaret had been planning before her death. Patricia Wells had called around 8 that evening to check on me and offer assistance with the business transition. "Mrs. Harper, I hope you know that all of us at Whitmore and Associates are here to support you however you need. Margaret spoke about you often, and we're excited to work with you." The confidence in her voice had been reassuring. Margaret's employees weren't viewing this transition as a disruption, but as a continuation of her vision under someone they trusted. "Can you help me understand the day-to-day operations?" I'd asked. "I want to be involved, not just an absent owner." Patricia had sounded pleased by this response. "Absolutely." Margaret always believed the funeral business required personal attention and genuine care. "Would you like to start by visiting each location and meeting the staff?" We'd arranged for me to begin touring the facilities the next morning, starting with Riverside Memorial Chapel where Margaret's service had been held. I'd also scheduled meetings with the accountant who managed the business finances and the marketing consultant who'd helped Margaret build her reputation across central Connecticut. David hadn't returned home that night, confirming that his decision to stay with Rachel was genuine rather than a temporary response to stress. Tyler had asked pointed questions about whether their father would be coming back, and I'd answered honestly that I didn't know his intentions. What I did know was that I needed legal representation for the inevitable divorce proceedings. David's abandonment had been cruel and public, but his sudden interest in reconciliation after learning about my inheritance revealed his true motivations clearly enough. The next morning, I'd driven to the law offices of Coleman and Associates, the family law firm that had been recommended by Frank Morrison. Sarah Coleman was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in high-asset divorces and had a reputation for protecting her clients' interests aggressively. After I'd explained the circumstances of David's departure and the inheritance that followed, Sarah had leaned back in her chair with a knowing expression. "Mrs. Harper, I've seen this pattern before. Men who abandon their families often experience sudden regret when financial circumstances change dramatically." "What are my options?" I'd asked. "Legally, you're in an excellent position," Sarah had explained. "Connecticut is an equitable distribution state, but assets inherited during marriage typically remain with the recipient spouse. Margaret's bequest to you personally, rather than to both spouses, protects the inheritance from division." This had been an enormous relief. David's timing in leaving before the will reading might have been cruel, but it had also been legally advantageous for protecting Margaret's legacy. However, Sarah had continued, "David will likely try to argue that he's entitled to support based on the lifestyle you can now afford. We need to document his voluntary abandonment and his current living situation with another woman." I'd provided Sarah with the details of my conversation with Rachel Stevens, including her admission that she and David had been involved for 6 months before his departure. Sarah had taken notes methodically, clearly building a case strategy. "I'm going to recommend that we have your husband's activities monitored for a few weeks," Sarah had said. "If he's living with his girlfriend while claiming he wants to reconcile, we need documentation of that hypocrisy." The idea of hiring investigators to follow David had felt strange, but Sarah's logic was sound. If David was going to challenge the divorce settlement based on my inheritance, I needed evidence of his actual motivations. From Coleman and Associates, I'd driven to Riverside Memorial Chapel for my first official visit as the owner of Whitmore and Associates. Patricia Wells had been waiting with the assistant manager and 2 other staff members, all clearly eager to meet their new boss. Walking through the facility with professional eyes rather than as a grieving family member, I'd been impressed by the attention to detail Margaret had insisted upon. Every surface was immaculate. The lighting was soft and comforting. The furniture was elegant without being ostentatious. No wonder families were willing to pay premium prices for services. Here, Margaret really understood that grief requires dignity, Patricia had explained as we'd toured the preparation rooms and office areas. She never wanted families to feel like they were being processed through a business transaction. "How do you handle families who can't afford your standard rates?" I'd asked, curious about Margaret's approach to serving the broader community. Patricia had smiled at this question. Margaret always said that financial hardship doesn't diminish the importance of honoring someone's life. We have a sliding scale for families in genuine need, and we've never turned anyone away because of money. This philosophy had resonated deeply with me. My background in social work had taught me that dignity and respect shouldn't be luxuries available only to wealthy families. Over the next several days, I'd visited all 6 Whitmore and Associates locations, meeting staff and learning about each facility's role in the overall operation. Margaret had positioned each funeral home to serve different community needs, from elaborate traditional services to simple memorial ceremonies to cremation services. The staff had been universally welcoming and supportive, clearly relieved that Margaret's successor shared her values rather than viewing the business purely as a financial investment. Several employees had mentioned how worried they'd been about the future before learning that I would be taking over. Meanwhile, the private investigator Sarah Coleman had recommended began documenting David's activities. Within a week, we had photographic evidence of David and Rachel entering and leaving her apartment together, attending restaurants and events as a couple, and generally living as if they were in a committed relationship. More damaging to any potential reconciliation claims, David had apparently been introducing Rachel to his colleagues and friends as his girlfriend, making no secret of their relationship or his intentions to divorce me. The investigator had recorded several conversations where David had disparaged our marriage and expressed relief at finally being free from suburban family obligations. David's first attempt at contact had come exactly 1 week after the will reading. He'd called while I was meeting with Margaret's accountant, going over financial projections for the coming year. "Linda, we need to talk," he'd said when I'd answered the phone. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I realize I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I'd repeated. "Abandoning your family at a funeral was a mistake?" I was overwhelmed by stress and grief, David had explained, his tone carefully measured. I wasn't thinking clearly. But now I realize we can work through our problems. The timing of this realization, coming exactly when he'd had a week to calculate how much money he was walking away from, hadn't been lost on me. "Where are you calling from, David?" I'd asked. "What do you mean? Are you calling from your apartment or from Rachel's apartment?" The pause before his answer had told me everything I needed to know. "Linda, my living situation right now is temporary while I figure things out. That's not what's important." "It's exactly what's important," I'd corrected him. "You left our marriage for another woman, and now you want to come back because I inherited money. That's not working through problems, David. That's opportunism." I'd ended the call and immediately contacted Sarah Coleman to report David's reconciliation attempt. As she'd predicted, his sudden change of heart had everything to do with my inheritance and nothing to do with genuine remorse. David's second attempt had been more elaborate. He'd shown up at Tyler's soccer game the following Saturday, apparently hoping to use our children's desire for family reconciliation to pressure me into giving him another chance. I'd been sitting in the bleachers watching Tyler play midfield when David had appeared beside me, wearing casual clothes and carrying coffee from the concession stand. "I brought you coffee," he'd said, offering me a cup. The way you like it, with cream and cinnamon. The gesture had been so typical of David's approach to problem solving, offering small, thoughtful acts as if they could compensate for major betrayals. "Thank you," I'd said, accepting the coffee but maintaining distance between us on the bleacher seat. "Tyler looks good out there," David had observed, apparently trying to establish normalcy through small talk about our son's athletic performance. "He's been having a difficult time since you left," I'd replied. "Both kids have been struggling with your decision to abandon the family." "I didn't abandon anyone," David had protested. "I was honest about my feelings instead of pretending everything was fine. You left us at Margaret's funeral, David. You're living with another woman. In what universe is that not abandonment?" Other parents had been glancing in our direction, clearly picking up on the tension in our conversation despite our efforts to keep our voices low. "Linda, I know I handled things badly," David had said, his voice taking on a pleading tone I'd never heard before. "But people make mistakes. We had 18 years together. Doesn't that count for something?" "It counted for something until you threw it away for a younger woman," I'd replied. "Now it's just evidence of how long you were able to lie to me." David had tried several more approaches during the soccer game, alternating between appeals to our shared history and promises about rebuilding our relationship. Each attempt had made it clearer that his motivation was financial rather than emotional. The conversation had reached its climax when David had made the mistake of referencing my inheritance directly. "We could travel now," he'd said, his enthusiasm getting the better of his strategy. "You've always wanted to visit Europe. With Margaret's money, we could afford to take the kids on amazing vacations." Margaret's money. The phrase had crystallized everything I needed to know about David's sudden desire for reconciliation. "David," I'd said quietly, "Margaret didn't leave me money so you could take European vacations. She left it to me because she recognized something about my character that apparently you never did." "What do you mean?" "She saw that I was capable of building something meaningful rather than just consuming resources. She trusted me to honor her legacy and serve families in our community with dignity and compassion." I'd stood up from the bleacher seat, ready to move away from David's increasingly desperate appeals. "That's the difference between us, David. You see Margaret's inheritance as money to be spent on lifestyle upgrades. I see it as responsibility to continue her work and build something lasting for our children's future." David had followed me down from the bleachers, his voice becoming more urgent as he'd realized his approach wasn't working. "You can't seriously be planning to run funeral homes, Linda. You don't know anything about that business." "I'm learning," I'd replied. "And I'm discovering that I have more business instincts than either of us realized." This had been true. My meetings with Margaret's staff and advisors had revealed talents I'd never fully utilized during my years as a suburban homemaker. I understood people's emotional needs, could communicate with families during crisis situations, and had organizational skills that translated well to business management. "Come on," David had pressed. "Be realistic. You'll get tired of the responsibility within 6 months and want to sell everything anyway. Why not work things out between us first?" "Because I don't want to work things out with you," I'd said simply. "You showed me exactly who you are when you left me at Margaret's funeral. Everything you've said since then has only confirmed that judgment." Tyler had scored a goal during this conversation, and our continued discussion was preventing me from celebrating his achievement properly. I'd moved closer to the field to cheer for our son, effectively ending David's reconciliation attempt. After the game, Tyler had approached us both with obvious hope that our conversation meant reconciliation was possible. "Are you coming home, Dad?" he'd asked, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes bright with possibility. David had looked at me before answering, clearly hoping I would provide some encouragement. When I'd remained silent, he'd struggled to explain his complicated situation to his son. "I'm working through some things right now, buddy. Your mom and I need to have more conversations before any big decisions get made." Tyler had picked up on the evasiveness in this response, his expression shifting from hope to disappointment. Why can't you just come home and work through things there? It's complicated, David had replied, the weak response of someone who couldn't admit to his son that he was living with his girlfriend. It's not complicated, I'd interjected gently. Your father is living with someone else right now. He's trying to decide between his current situation and coming back to our family. Tyler had stared at David with an expression that aged him beyond his 16 years. You have a girlfriend? Is that why you left us at the funeral? David's face had flushed red, confirming Tyler's assumption without requiring a verbal response. Dad, that's really messed up, Tyler had said, his voice filled with disappointment rather than anger. Great-Aunt Margaret died, and you used her funeral to dump Mom for some other woman? The blunt summary from his own son had visibly shaken David, but not enough to generate genuine accountability. Tyler, you don't understand all the factors involved in adult relationships, David had said, attempting to maintain parental authority while defending his indefensible behavior. I understand that you hurt Mom really badly at the worst possible time, Tyler had replied, and now you want to come back because she inherited money. That's not complicated, Dad. That's just wrong. With that assessment, Tyler had walked away from both of us, heading toward the parking lot where several teammates were waiting for rides home. David had turned to me with a desperate expression. You turned him against me. I didn't have to turn. Him against you, David. Your own actions accomplished that perfectly well. That evening, I'd received a call from Frank Morrison with an update on the estate settlement process. Mrs. Harper, I thought you should know that your husband contacted my office this afternoon asking about possibilities for contesting Margaret's will. The news hadn't surprised me, but it had confirmed that David's reconciliation attempts were becoming more calculated. What did you tell him? I'd asked. I explained that Margaret's will is legally sound and that contesting it would be both expensive and unsuccessful, Frank had replied. I also mentioned that attempting to interfere with estate proceedings could have legal consequences for him personally. This information had prompted me to schedule an emergency meeting with Sarah Coleman to discuss protective measures for my inheritance. Sarah had been blunt in her assessment. Mrs. Harper, your husband is becoming increasingly desperate as he realizes what he's lost. We need to move quickly to finalize divorce proceedings before he can cause more complications. She'd recommended filing for divorce immediately based on David's abandonment and adultery, seeking a quick settlement that would protect my inheritance while providing appropriate support for our children. The divorce papers had been prepared and served to David at his workplace the following week. According to the process server, David had been visibly shocked to receive legal documents at Premier Insurance Group, apparently not expecting me to move so quickly toward formal proceedings. That evening, David had called in a panic, his voice higher and more strained than I'd ever heard it. Linda, what the hell are these divorce papers? You can't be serious about this. I'm completely serious, I'd replied calmly. You abandoned our marriage, David. I'm simply making it official. But we haven't even tried counseling? You're not giving us a chance to work things out? You forfeited your chance to work things out when you moved in with Rachel, I'd pointed out. Marriage counseling requires two people committed to the relationship. You're committed to someone else. The conversation had devolved into David making increasingly frantic arguments about why divorce was premature, each one revealing more clearly that his primary concern was financial rather than emotional. He'd mentioned the children's need for stability, the importance of preserving family assets, and the wisdom of not making permanent decisions during stressful times. What he hadn't mentioned was love, regret about losing our relationship, or any genuine desire to rebuild the trust he'd shattered. His arguments had all centered on practical considerations and financial implications. The next phase of my strategic response had involved consolidating my position as the new owner of Whitmore and Associates. Margaret had built an impressive business, but there were opportunities for expansion and improvement that she'd been considering before her death. I'd scheduled meetings with the key staff members at each location to discuss their ideas for enhancing services and reaching new clients. Patricia Wells had been particularly insightful about marketing opportunities we'd been missing. Mrs. Harper, we get calls regularly from families who want more personalized services than the big corporate chains offer. But they can't quite afford our premium rates, she'd explained during a meeting at Riverside Memorial Chapel. What if we created a mid-tier service package? I'd suggested. Something that maintains our quality standards but streamlines certain aspects to reduce costs. That's exactly what Margaret was discussing before she passed away, Patricia had said with excitement. She felt there was a huge market for dignified services at accessible prices. Over the following weeks, I'd worked with the staff to develop new service options that would expand our client base while maintaining the reputation for excellence Margaret had established. We'd also explored partnerships with local churches and community organizations to ensure families in financial distress could still access quality funeral services. The business side of my new life had been energizing in ways I hadn't expected. After years of managing household schedules and supporting other people's careers, I'd discovered genuine enthusiasm for building something meaningful myself. Meanwhile, David's behavior had become increasingly erratic as the reality of his situation fully sank in. The private investigator Sarah Coleman had hired continued documenting his activities, revealing a pattern of desperation that would serve us well in divorce proceedings. David had apparently been researching Connecticut divorce law extensively, looking for loopholes that might entitle him to a portion of my inheritance. He'd consulted with multiple attorneys, each of whom had presumably explained that inherited assets typically remained with the recipient spouse. More damaging to his credibility, David had also been discussing his situation openly with colleagues at Premier Insurance Group, many of whom had expressed shock at his decision to leave his family during a funeral. The investigator had recorded several conversations where David had tried to justify his actions while clearly struggling with the consequences. His relationship with Rachel had also begun showing strain under the pressure of his financial concerns. According to surveillance reports, they'd had several heated arguments in public places, with Rachel apparently growing tired of David's obsession with my inheritance and his constant speculation about reconciliation possibilities. 3 weeks after the divorce papers had been served, David had made his most desperate attempt yet to regain control of the situation. He'd shown up at our house on a Saturday morning while Tyler and Chloe were at their respective activities, apparently hoping to have a private conversation without the children present. I'd been reviewing business plans for a new cremation facility when the doorbell had rung. Opening the door to find David standing on our front porch with flowers and a bottle of wine had felt surreal, like encountering a ghost from my previous life. "Linda, please let me come in so we can talk properly," he'd said, his tone carefully modulated to project sincerity and regret. "We can talk on the porch," I'd replied, stepping outside but leaving the door open behind me. David had clearly prepared for this conversation, beginning with what sounded like a rehearsed apology that touched on all the points a marriage counselor might have suggested. "I know I hurt you terribly, and I take full responsibility for that. I was going through a midlife crisis and made terrible decisions that I regret deeply." The phrase midlife crisis had struck me as particularly calculated, suggesting temporary insanity rather than deliberate betrayal. "I've ended things completely with Rachel," David had continued. "I realized that what we had was just escapism from problems I should have addressed within our marriage." This claim had contradicted the surveillance reports Sarah's investigator had provided just days earlier, showing David and Rachel together at a restaurant in Hartford. "David," I'd said quietly, "you were with Rachel at Piccolo Mondo on Thursday night. You're still living at her apartment. Why are you lying to me about ending the relationship?" His face had flushed, caught in a deception he'd apparently thought I wouldn't discover. "We're working through the transition," he'd said, stumbling over his words. "It's complicated to end a relationship cleanly while trying to rebuild our marriage. You can't rebuild our marriage while living with another woman," I'd pointed out. "That's not rebuilding anything. That's trying to keep both options available until you decide which is more advantageous. David had abandoned his prepared speech and shifted to direct pleading, his voice taking on an edge of desperation I'd never heard before. Linda, you have to understand the pressure I'm under. My career is suffering because people know about our separation. My colleagues are treating me differently. I made a mistake, but I'm trying to fix it. Your career is suffering because you abandoned your family at a funeral, not because of our separation, I'd corrected. People are treating you differently because your behavior was shocking and inappropriate. But we can get past that if we work together, David had insisted. People forgive and forget if couples reconcile successfully. This had revealed another layer of David's motivation, his concern about professional reputation and social standing within our community. Are you asking me to take you back to help rehabilitate your image? I'd asked directly. I'm asking you to take me back because we love each other and we built a life together, David had replied, though his eyes had avoided mine when he'd said it. We built a life together, I'd agreed. And then you destroyed it for a woman you've known for 6 months. Love doesn't survive that kind of betrayal, David. David had tried several more approaches during our porch conversation, alternating between romantic appeals and practical arguments about why reconciliation made sense. He'd mentioned our shared history, the children's welfare, financial advantages of staying married, and the potential for rebuilding trust through counseling. Each argument had revealed more clearly that David viewed our marriage as a strategic arrangement rather than an emotional bond. He'd spoken about cost-benefit analyses and long-term planning as if our relationship was a business merger rather than a romantic partnership. The conversation had reached its turning point when David had finally addressed my inheritance directly. Linda, you've inherited an incredible opportunity, but running funeral homes is a huge responsibility. You'll need support from someone who understands business and finance. I have excellent support from Margaret's existing staff and advisors, I'd replied. They've been running this business successfully for decades. But you'll need a partner you can trust completely, David had pressed. Someone who has your best interests at heart and understands your long-term goals. Like someone who abandoned me at a funeral and moved in with his secretary? I'd asked. That kind of trustworthy partner? David's face had hardened at this response, his carefully constructed appeal giving way to frustration and anger. You're being unreasonable, Linda. People make mistakes. Successful couples work through problems instead of running straight to divorce lawyers. Successful couples don't abandon each other during family funerals, I'd countered. And they certainly don't move in with other people while claiming they want to reconcile. Fine, David had snapped, his diplomatic mask finally slipping completely. But don't think you can just take everything and leave me with nothing. I have rights as your husband, and I contributed to building our life together. You have rights to assets we built together during our marriage, I'd agreed. But you don't have rights to inheritance I received personally, especially inheritance you tried to prevent me from accepting. What do you mean tried to prevent? David had asked, though something in his expression suggested he knew exactly what I meant. Margaret wanted to discuss her estate plans with me several times over the past year, I'd explained. You always found excuses to avoid those conversations or suggested I was imposing on her time. I was trying to protect you from getting too involved in family drama, David had protested weakly. You were trying to minimize my relationship with someone who might leave me money, I'd corrected. You didn't want me developing closer ties with Margaret because you were already planning to leave and didn't want me to have independent resources. This accusation had clearly hit close to home, as David's defensive reaction had been immediate and overblown. That's completely unfair, Linda. I always supported your relationship with Margaret. You supported it when it involved occasional visits and holiday gifts, I'd said. You became uncomfortable when it looked like she might treat me as family rather than just a distant relative. The truth was that David's discomfort with Margaret had intensified over the past year as she'd become more generous with gifts and more interested in including me in family financial discussions. He'd discouraged me from accepting expensive presents and suggested that Margaret's generosity was creating inappropriate obligations. Looking back, I could see that David had been trying to limit my relationship with Margaret while building his relationship with Rachel, positioning himself to leave our marriage without me having significant independent resources. His timing in abandoning me the day before Margaret's will reading had been intended to ensure that any inheritance would be received during our separation, potentially making it subject to division as marital property. "David," I'd said finally, "our marriage ended when you walked away from Margaret's grave. Everything that's happened since then has just been paperwork and logistics." "You're making a mistake, Linda," David had said, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "You think you can handle running a business and raising 2 teenagers alone, but you'll realize soon enough that you need help." "I'll handle it just fine," I'd replied with confidence I genuinely felt. Margaret built this business from nothing, and she believed I could continue her work successfully. David had left that day with his flowers and wine, clearly frustrated that his reconciliation attempt had failed so completely. But his parting words had contained an implicit threat that suggested he wasn't finished trying to claim a portion of my inheritance. The next week had brought news that confirmed my suspicions about David's intentions. Sarah Coleman had called with an update about David's legal consultations. "Mrs. Harper, we've learned that your husband has retained counsel with a firm that specializes in high-asset divorce cases. They're apparently planning to argue that your inheritance should be considered marital property because you received it while still legally married." This strategy had been predictable, though legally weak according to Sarah's analysis. "The good news is that Connecticut law is very clear about inherited assets," Sarah had explained. "The bad news is that David's attorneys will likely try to drag out proceedings and make the divorce as expensive as possible for you." We'd discussed counter-strategy options, including documenting David's abandonment, his ongoing relationship with Rachel, and his attempts to discourage my relationship with Margaret prior to her death. "I want to move quickly to finalize everything," I'd told Sarah. "David's trying to use delay tactics to pressure me into a settlement that includes inheritance assets." Sarah had agreed to pursue an expedited divorce timeline, citing David's abandonment and adultery as grounds for accelerated proceedings. Meanwhile, my work with Whitmore and Associates had been progressing remarkably well. The new mid-tier service package had attracted several families who'd previously felt priced out of our offerings, and word was spreading through the community about our commitment to serving everyone regardless of financial circumstances. I'd also been invited to join the Connecticut Funeral Directors Association, where Margaret had been a respected member for decades. Attending my first meeting as a business owner rather than as someone's wife had felt empowering in ways I was still processing. James Reed, Margaret's longtime business partner, had been particularly supportive during the transition. "Margaret always said you had excellent instincts about people," he'd told me after a planning meeting. "She was right to trust you with continuing her work." The business aspects of my new life had been challenging but rewarding, engaging skills I'd developed during my social work career while teaching me about financial management and strategic planning. More importantly, I'd discovered genuine passion for the work itself. Helping families navigate grief while honoring their loved ones' lives felt meaningful in ways that managing household schedules never had. David's next major move had come, exactly 1 month after our porch conversation. His attorney had filed a motion requesting temporary spousal support based on my inheritance, arguing that David needed financial assistance while the divorce was pending. The motion had included detailed calculations about my new income potential and suggestions that David deserved support commensurate with the lifestyle my inheritance could provide. Sarah Coleman had been dismissive of these arguments when we'd met to discuss our response. "This is a fishing expedition, Mrs. Harper. They're hoping you'll agree to a settlement rather than fight a public battle over money." Instead, we'd filed our own motion requesting expedited divorce proceedings based on David's abandonment and adultery, including photographic evidence of his ongoing relationship with Rachel. The court filings had made David's situation very public, with details about his affair and abandonment becoming part of the official record. His professional reputation, already damaged by his behavior at Margaret's funeral, had suffered further harm from the legal documentation of his misconduct. According to my investigators' reports, David's colleagues at Premier Insurance Group had been discussing the court filings extensively, with many expressing shock at the extent of his deception and poor judgment. His relationship with Rachel had also deteriorated significantly under the pressure of public scrutiny and legal expenses. The investigator had documented several arguments between them, with Rachel apparently questioning whether David was worth the drama and social complications his situation had created. 2 weeks after the court filings, David had made his final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. He'd called requesting an urgent meeting, claiming he had important information I needed to hear. We'd agreed to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Millbrook, where our conversation would be public but private enough for serious discussion. David had arrived looking haggard and defeated, his usually polished appearance replaced by wrinkled clothes and an obvious lack of sleep. "Linda, I need you to know that I never meant for things to get this complicated." He'd begun, his voice subdued and uncertain. "Things aren't complicated, David," I'd replied. "You left our marriage for another woman, and now you're facing the consequences of that decision." "But the money changes everything," he'd said urgently. "We could have an amazing life together now. We could travel, send the kids to any colleges they want, maybe buy a vacation house." "The money doesn't change what you did to our family," I'd pointed out. "And it doesn't change the fact that you're still involved with Rachel." David had looked genuinely surprised by this response. "I told you I ended things with her." "You told me that, but it wasn't true," I'd corrected. "You're still living together, still appearing in public as a couple, still making plans for a future. That doesn't include me." David had tried to explain the complexities of his living situation, but his explanations had only made it clearer that he was trying to maintain both relationships until he could determine which was more advantageous. The conversation had continued for an hour, with David making increasingly desperate appeals about why reconciliation made sense financially and practically. What he'd never mentioned was missing me personally, regretting the loss of our emotional connection or feeling genuine remorse about the pain he'd caused our children. His arguments had all focused on external factors, financial opportunities, social advantages, and practical considerations about managing business and family responsibilities. By the end of our meeting, I'd felt profound sadness about the end of our marriage, but also complete certainty that reconciliation was impossible. David had revealed himself to be someone who viewed relationships as strategic arrangements rather than emotional bonds. His sudden interest in our marriage had everything to do with my inheritance, and nothing to do with love or commitment. "Goodbye, David," I'd said, as we'd prepared to leave the coffee shop. "I hope you find whatever it is you're actually looking for." His response had been telling. "What I'm looking for is what we had before everything got complicated. What we had before was built on lies and deception," I'd replied. "I just didn't realize it at the time." Walking away from that final conversation, I'd felt not heartbreak, but liberation. The man I'd thought I'd married had never actually existed. The person David had revealed himself to be over the past months wasn't someone I'd ever want to rebuild a life with, regardless of financial considerations. The divorce proceedings moved forward quickly after that meeting, with David's attorneys eventually agreeing to a settlement that protected my inheritance while providing appropriate child support. David had finally accepted that his strategic miscalculation was permanent, that abandoning me before Margaret's will reading had cost him access to wealth beyond his imagining. The final confrontation came on a Tuesday morning in late November, exactly 2 months after Margaret's funeral. I was reviewing expansion plans for a new location in Waterbury when my assistant informed me that David was in the lobby of Riverside Memorial Chapel, demanding to speak with me immediately. His timing couldn't have been worse from his perspective. I'd been meeting with a delegation from the Connecticut Better Business Bureau, who were considering Whitmore and Associates for their annual Excellence in Service Award. The BBB representatives had been impressed by our community outreach programs and our innovative approach to making quality funeral services accessible to families of all economic backgrounds. When I'd walked into the lobby to find David pacing near the reception area, his appearance had been shocking. The polished insurance executive I'd been married to for 18 years had been replaced by someone who looked like he hadn't slept properly in weeks. His suit was expensive but poorly fitted, as if he'd lost weight rapidly. His hair needed cutting, and his eyes held a desperate quality that made our receptionist visibly uncomfortable. "Linda, I need 5 minutes of your time," he'd said loudly, enough that the BBB representatives could hear him from the consultation room where they'd been waiting. "David, this isn't an appropriate time or place," I'd replied calmly. "I'm in the middle of an important business meeting. More important than—" "Your husband?" he'd demanded, his voice rising in a way that would have been embarrassing under any circumstances, but was particularly inappropriate in a funeral home setting. "My ex-husband," I'd corrected him. "And yes, my business obligations are more important than whatever crisis has brought you here today." The distinction between husband and ex-husband had clearly stung, as David's face had flushed with anger and humiliation. "We're still legally married, Linda. The divorce isn't final yet, only because your attorneys keep filing delaying motions," I'd pointed out. "The settlement has been agreed upon. We're just waiting for the paperwork to be processed." Patricia Wells had appeared from her office, clearly having heard David's raised voice and recognizing that the situation required professional intervention. "Mr. Harper, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice or conduct your conversation outside," she'd said with the firm but gentle tone she used with grieving families who became emotionally overwhelmed. "This is between me and my wife," David had snapped, apparently forgetting that he was standing in a place of business where professional decorum was essential. "This is a funeral home, not a marriage counseling office," Patricia had replied evenly. "We have families here who deserve respect and privacy during their difficult times." David had looked around the lobby as if suddenly remembering where he was, but instead of being embarrassed by his inappropriate behavior, he'd seemed to become more agitated. "Of course it's a funeral home," he'd said with bitter sarcasm. "Everything revolves around these damn funeral homes now. My wife inherited money, and suddenly she thinks she's too good for her family." The accusation had been so unfair and so publicly humiliating that I'd felt my own composure beginning to crack for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun. "David, you abandoned your family at a funeral," I'd said with quiet intensity. "You moved in with your girlfriend before Margaret was even buried. You don't get to stand in my place of business and accuse me of abandoning anyone." "I made a mistake," he'd shouted, no longer caring about maintaining appropriate volume in a professional setting. "People make mistakes, Linda, but you're acting like I committed some unforgivable crime." "You abandoned your children at their great-aunt's funeral," I'd replied, my voice getting louder despite my efforts to remain professional. "You left them confused and heartbroken while you ran off to play house with a woman barely older than our daughter would be in a few years." The BBB representatives had emerged from the consultation room, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing what was obviously a very personal and heated argument. "Mrs. Harper, perhaps we should reschedule our meeting," the lead representative had suggested diplomatically. "I'm so sorry for this disruption," I'd said, mortified that David's behavior was interfering with important business relationships I'd been working months to develop. "Don't apologize for me," David had interjected angrily. "I'm not some stranger causing problems. I'm her husband, and I have every right to be here." "You have no rights here," I'd said firmly. "This is my business, my property, and my workplace. You're disrupting operations and disturbing clients during one of the most difficult times in their lives." "Your business," David had repeated mockingly. 6 months ago, you were a suburban housewife who hadn't worked in 15 years. Now you think you're some kind of business mogul because an old lady left you money." The dismissive way he'd referred to Margaret as an old lady had triggered something fierce in my response. That old lady built something meaningful that serves our community, I'd said, my voice cold with fury. She worked for 50 years to create dignity and comfort for families during their worst moments. She trusted me to continue that work because she recognized qualities in me that you never bothered to see. She left you money because she felt sorry for you, David had shot back cruelly. She knew I was planning to leave and wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of. The claim had been so outrageous and so clearly false that I'd actually laughed. Margaret died without knowing you were planning anything, David. Her will was finalized 3 weeks before she passed away, when you were still pretending to be a devoted husband. David's face had gone pale as he'd realized the implication of what I'd just said. How do you know when her will was finalized? He'd asked, his voice suddenly uncertain. Because I pay attention to details, I'd replied. Margaret had been planning to leave me her business for months, possibly years. It had nothing to do with your abandonment, and everything to do with her assessment of my character versus yours. The lobby had fallen completely silent except for the soft classical music that played continuously in Whitmore and Associates facilities. The BBB representatives had been standing awkwardly near the entrance, clearly wanting to leave but unsure of the appropriate etiquette for extracting themselves from such an uncomfortable situation. Patricia had taken charge of the immediate crisis, approaching the business visitors with professional smoothness. Gentlemen, why don't I show you our new consultation suites while Mrs. Harper handles this family matter? We can continue your tour and reschedule the formal presentation for later this week. Her diplomatic intervention had allowed the BBB delegation to leave with their dignity intact, though I'd known the incident would require significant relationship repair work later. Once the lobby had cleared of outside witnesses, David had seemed to deflate slightly, his anger giving way to something that looked more like desperation. Linda, you have to understand the position I'm in, he'd said, his voice becoming pleading rather than hostile. My career is destroyed. People in Hartford know about our situation, and they're treating me like I'm some kind of pariah. Your career problems are the natural consequence of your behavior, I'd pointed out. When you abandon your family at a funeral, people notice. When you move in with your secretary, your professional reputation suffers. But it doesn't have to be permanent, David had argued. If we reconciled, people would respect that we worked through our problems. My reputation could recover. This had been the heart of David's desperation, I'd realized. His professional standing in Hartford's insurance community had been severely damaged by the public nature of his abandonment and affair. Reconciling with me wouldn't just give him access to my inheritance, it would rehabilitate his image as someone who'd made mistakes, but ultimately done the right thing. Your reputation can't recover because what you did was genuinely shocking, David, I'd said. Abandoning your family at a funeral isn't a minor marital spat that can be forgiven and forgotten. David had tried several more approaches during our lobby confrontation, alternating between appeals to our shared history and threats about making the divorce proceedings more difficult and expensive. You think you can just write me out of your life like I never mattered, he'd said at one point. But we have 18 years together, Linda. We have children together. You can't erase all of that. I'm not trying to erase our history, I'd replied. I'm accepting that our history ended when you walked away from Margaret's grave. The conversation had taken an even more disturbing turn when David had begun making veiled threats about my ability to manage the funeral home business successfully. You don't know what you're getting into with these businesses, Linda. The funeral industry is more complicated than you realize. There are regulations, professional relationships, community politics. You'll need help from someone who understands how to navigate those waters. I have excellent advisors and experienced staff, I'd said. Margaret built a successful operation with the same resources I have now. Margaret spent 50 years learning that business, David had pressed. You think? You can just step in and run everything perfectly from day one? There had been something ominous in his tone that had made me wonder whether David was planning to interfere with my business operations somehow. "Are you threatening to sabotage my work, David?" I'd asked directly. "I'm just pointing out realities. You might not have considered," he'd replied with false innocence. "The funeral business depends on community trust and professional relationships. If people start questioning your judgment or stability, it could affect your success." The implication had been clear. David was considering ways to damage my professional reputation if I didn't agree to reconciliation on his terms. "David, if you interfere with my business in any way, I'll pursue legal action that will make our current divorce proceedings look friendly," I'd warned him. "I'm not interfering with anything," he'd protested. "I'm just concerned about your welfare and the children's future security." Tyler and Chloe's future security improved dramatically when I inherited assets that will provide for their education and long-term needs, I'd pointed out. Their security decreased when their father abandoned them at a funeral. The mention of our children had seemed to trigger genuine emotion in David for the first time during our confrontation. "I miss them," he'd said, his voice suddenly quiet and vulnerable. "Tyler won't return my calls, and Chloe only talks to me when I force the issue. They hate me, Linda." "They don't hate you," I'd replied honestly. "They're disappointed in you, and they're confused about why you left. But they're also resilient, and they'll find ways to maintain a relationship with you if you stop trying to manipulate everyone around you." "How am I manipulating anyone?" David had asked, seeming genuinely puzzled by the accusation. "You're using their desire for family stability as leverage to pressure me into reconciliation," I'd explained. "You're making them feel responsible for your happiness while refusing to take accountability for the choices that created this situation." David had attempted to argue that his desire to reconcile was motivated by love for our family rather than self-interest, but his arguments had been undermined by months of evidence to the contrary. "If you loved our family, you wouldn't have abandoned us at Margaret's funeral," I'd said simply. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have moved in with another woman. If you loved our children, you wouldn't be putting them through this extended drama, while you try to decide which life arrangement is more advantageous." The conversation had been interrupted by the arrival of a grieving family who needed to discuss arrangements for their father's services. Patricia had appeared immediately to escort them to a private consultation room, but their presence had been a stark reminder that David's emotional crisis was being played out in a place dedicated to helping others navigate loss and grief. "I need to get back to work," I'd told David firmly. "Families are depending on me to help them through the worst days of their lives. I can't spend any more time on this conversation." "So that's it?" David had asked, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and desperation. "You're just going to dismiss me like I'm some annoying interruption?" "You are an annoying interruption," I'd replied bluntly. "You abandoned our marriage, moved in with your girlfriend, and now you're harassing me at my workplace because you've realized what you gave up." David had made one final appeal, his voice breaking with what sounded like genuine emotion. "Linda, please. I know I screwed up terribly. I know I hurt you and the kids in ways that might be unforgivable. But we had something real for 18 years. Doesn't that deserve one more chance?" "What we had for 18 years was real for me," I'd said quietly. "But it apparently wasn't real for you, or you wouldn't have been able to throw it away so easily." "I didn't throw it away easily," David had protested. "This whole thing has been agony for me." "Then you should have thought about that before you started sleeping with your secretary," I'd replied. "You should have considered the consequences before you abandoned your family at a funeral." David had stood in the lobby for several more minutes, after our conversation had ended, apparently hoping I would change my mind or soften my position. When it had become clear that I wasn't going to continue the discussion, he'd finally left, but not before making one last desperate statement. "You'll regret this, Linda. When you realize how hard it is to manage everything alone, you'll wish you'd been more willing to work things out." The threat had been hollow, coming from someone who clearly had no leverage left in our relationship. After David had gone, I'd spent an hour apologizing to staff members who'd witnessed the confrontation and reassuring them that family drama wouldn't become a regular disruption to our professional environment. Patricia had been particularly supportive, sharing that several employees had been concerned about how my personal situation might affect the business. "Mrs. Harper, I want you to know that everyone here has complete confidence in your leadership," she'd said. "What happened with your husband was shocking, but the way you've handled everything since then has been remarkable." The BBB representatives had been gracious about rescheduling our meeting, though I'd known David's outburst had damaged the impression I'd been trying to create about Whitmore & Associates' professional culture. That evening, I'd called Sarah Coleman to report David's threats about interfering with my business operations. "Mrs. Harper, document everything," she'd advised. "If David attempts to sabotage your professional relationships or spread false information about your competence, we'll pursue harassment charges that could result in significant financial penalties." Sarah had also informed me that David's attorneys had filed another delaying motion in our divorce proceedings, apparently hoping to stretch out the legal process until I became frustrated enough to agree to a more generous settlement. "They're probably advising him that time is on his side," she'd explained. "They think you'll eventually get tired of the conflict and offer him a portion of your inheritance just to end the marriage." Instead, we'd filed a motion requesting sanctions against David's legal team for pursuing frivolous delays, citing his public harassment at my workplace as evidence that he was using the legal system to continue emotional abuse. The following week had brought news that confirmed David's situation was becoming increasingly desperate. His relationship with Rachel had finally ended, apparently because she'd grown tired of the drama and legal complications surrounding his divorce. According to my investigator's final report, Rachel had been overheard telling colleagues that dating a married man going through a contentious divorce had become more trouble than it was worth, especially when the man was clearly still obsessed with his estranged wife's money. David had also been asked to take a leave of absence from Premier Insurance Group, while their Human Resources Department investigated complaints about his behavior and its impact on the company's professional reputation. The combination of losing both his girlfriend and his job had apparently triggered the desperate confrontation at my workplace, as David had realized that all of his strategic miscalculations were leading to complete personal and professional ruin. 2 weeks later, David had finally instructed his attorneys to accept the divorce settlement we'd proposed months earlier. The agreement protected my inheritance completely while providing appropriate child support and limited spousal support for a brief transition period. The final divorce hearing had been scheduled for December 15th, just over 3 months after Margaret's funeral and David's abandonment of our family. On the morning of the hearing, I'd arrived at the courthouse in Hartford feeling not sadness about the end of my marriage, but relief that the legal complications were finally being resolved. David had appeared with his attorney, looking resigned and defeated rather than combative. The months of legal maneuvering and failed reconciliation attempts had apparently exhausted his energy for fighting. The judge had reviewed our settlement agreement and confirmed that both parties were entering into the divorce voluntarily, with full understanding of their rights and obligations. When asked if there was any possibility of reconciliation, I answered clearly and firmly that the marriage was irretrievably broken and that I had no interest in counseling or mediation. David had been given the same opportunity to speak, and his response had been telling. "Your Honor, I made mistakes that I regret deeply, but I understand that my wife has decided to move forward with her life, and I respect her decision." Even in that final moment, David had been unable to take full accountability for his actions, describing his abandonment and affair as mistakes rather than deliberate choices that had destroyed our family. The judge had granted our divorce decree, officially ending 18 years of marriage and giving me complete legal control over my inheritance and business operations. Walking out of the courthouse, I'd felt a profound sense of closure and liberation. The woman who'd been abandoned at her great-aunt's funeral 3 months earlier had emerged as a successful business owner with the financial security to provide for her children's futures and the emotional strength to build a new life on her own terms. David had lingered in the courthouse parking lot, apparently hoping for one final conversation, but I'd walked past him to my car without acknowledgement. The man who'd once shared my life had become a stranger through his own choices, and I had no interest in prolonging our connection any further than necessary for co-parenting our children. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I stood in the chapel of our newest Whitmore & Associates location in Waterbury, watching families gather to honor the life of Eleanor Martinez, a beloved elementary school teacher who'd touched countless lives during her 40-year career. The service was exactly the kind Margaret would have been proud of, dignified and personal, focused entirely on celebrating Eleanor's legacy rather than the business transaction that made it possible. The Waterbury expansion had been my first major decision as the sole owner of the funeral home chain, and it had proven even more successful than our projections had predicted. The community had welcomed us enthusiastically, particularly after word spread about our sliding scale pricing and commitment to serving families regardless of their financial circumstances. Tyler had driven down from his first semester at University of Connecticut to attend Eleanor's service, not because he'd known her personally, but because he'd wanted to see the business that had transformed our family's life. At 17, he'd developed a mature understanding of how Margaret's inheritance had provided stability and opportunity during what could have been a devastating period. "Mom, this place is beautiful," he'd whispered as we'd taken our seats in the back of the chapel. "Mrs. Martinez's family looks so peaceful." "That's the goal," I'd whispered back. Margaret always said that funeral services should provide comfort and closure, not additional stress. Chloe had chosen to stay home to work on a college application essay, but she'd been equally supportive of my business endeavors. At 15, she'd surprised me with her entrepreneurial instincts, suggesting marketing strategies and community outreach ideas that had proven remarkably effective. Both of my children had adjusted to our new life with resilience that continued to amaze me. The initial trauma of David's abandonment had gradually been replaced by pride in our family's ability to thrive independently and contribute meaningfully to our community. David's relationship with Tyler and Chloe had stabilized into something functional, if not particularly close. He'd moved to Boston for a new job opportunity, claiming he needed a fresh start away from the social complications his behavior had created in Connecticut. The distance had actually improved his interactions with the children, as his visits required planning and intentionality rather than the casual drop-ins that had been awkward for everyone. He'd also stopped making any references to my inheritance or business success, apparently having accepted that his financial future would be built independently of the wealth he'd walked away from. His child support payments arrived promptly each month, and he'd been appropriately supportive of Tyler's college plans and Chloe's artistic pursuits. The transformation in my own daily life had been remarkable. Instead of managing household schedules and supporting other people's ambitions, I'd discovered genuine passion for building something meaningful that served families during their most difficult moments. The work wasn't always easy. Dealing with grief and loss on a daily basis required emotional resilience and professional boundaries I'd had to develop over time. But the satisfaction of helping families create dignified farewells for their loved ones felt deeply purposeful in ways that suburban homemaking never had. My relationship with Margaret's memory had evolved as well. Initially, I'd felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of continuing her legacy and maintaining the standards she'd established over 5 decades. But as I'd grown more confident in my business judgment and developed my own vision for expansion and innovation, I'd begun to understand that Margaret had chosen me not to be her replica, but to be her successor. The monthly staff meetings had become opportunities for collaborative planning rather than reports to an absent owner. Patricia Wells and the other senior managers had embraced my leadership style, which emphasized team input and community responsiveness over rigid adherence to traditional protocols. We'd implemented several new services during my first year as owner, including grief counseling support groups, memorial planning assistance for families dealing with terminal diagnoses, and partnership programs with local hospice organizations. Each innovation had strengthened our reputation as a funeral home chain that genuinely cared about serving families rather than maximizing profits. The financial success had been equally gratifying. Margaret's business model had been sound, but there had been room for growth and efficiency improvements that increased both revenue and community impact. The expansion into Waterbury had been followed by preliminary discussions about locations in New Haven and Stamford, though I'd been careful not to grow too rapidly. My personal life had also begun flourishing in unexpected ways. The confidence I'd gained from successfully managing a complex business had spilled over into social situations and community involvement. I'd joined the Millbrook Chamber of Commerce, volunteered with local charity organizations, and reconnected with friends who'd been gradually excluded from my life during the final years of my marriage. Romance hadn't been a priority during my first year of independence, but I'd begun accepting invitations to social events and developing friendships with people who appreciated my intelligence and accomplishments, rather than viewing me as an appendage to someone else's career. James Reed, Margaret's former business partner, had been particularly supportive during my transition to ownership. At 68, he'd been considering retirement when Margaret died, but my energy and vision for expanding community services had convinced him to delay those plans. "Linda, you've brought something special to this business," he'd told me during a recent planning meeting. "Margaret built something wonderful, but you're taking it to the next level." The comment had meant more to me than he'd probably realized. For 18 years, I'd received praise primarily for supporting other people's achievements. Being recognized for my own accomplishments and leadership abilities had been profoundly validating. The most unexpected aspect of my new life had been discovering entrepreneurial instincts I'd never known I possessed. The social work background that had seemed irrelevant to business management had actually provided excellent preparation for understanding client needs and building trust-based relationships. My legal training from decades earlier had also proven valuable in navigating regulatory requirements and contract negotiations. Skills I'd developed but never fully utilized were finally finding appropriate application in meaningful work. The annual Connecticut Funeral Directors Association conference had been a milestone event for me personally. Attending as a business owner rather than as someone's spouse had felt like stepping into an identity I'd never known I wanted. Other funeral home owners, many of whom had known and respected Margaret for decades, had welcomed me warmly and treated me as a legitimate colleague rather than a temporary placeholder. Several had expressed interest in collaborative ventures and professional partnerships. Dr. Susan Chen, who owned a family funeral business in Hartford, had become both a professional mentor and personal friend. "Linda, what you've accomplished in such a short time is remarkable," she'd said during the conference. Margaret chose her successor wisely. The validation from respected professionals in the funeral industry had confirmed that my success wasn't simply the result of inheriting a profitable business, but reflected genuine competence and vision. Tyler's college application process had provided another opportunity to reflect on how dramatically our circumstances had changed. Instead of worrying about financial aid and student loans, we'd been able to focus entirely on finding the right academic and social environment for his interests and goals. His acceptance to several competitive universities had been a source of tremendous pride, not just because of his achievements, but because Margaret's generosity had ensured that his educational opportunities wouldn't be limited by financial constraints. Chloe's artistic development had also flourished under our new circumstances. Private lessons, summer art programs, and high-quality supplies were no longer budget considerations, but investments in her talent and passion. Both children had learned important lessons about resilience, character, and the difference between people who support you during difficulties versus those who abandon you when they no longer find the relationship advantageous. The first anniversary of Margaret's death had been emotionally complex, but ultimately meaningful. Instead of a traditional memorial service, I'd organized a community appreciation event at Riverside Memorial Chapel, inviting families who'd been served by Whitmore and Associates to share memories and celebrate Margaret's impact on their lives. The response had been overwhelming. More than 200 people had attended, sharing stories about Margaret's kindness, professionalism, and genuine care during their most difficult moments. Eleanor Rodriguez, whose husband's funeral had been one of Margaret's final services, had spoken movingly about the difference Margaret's compassion had made during her grief process. Mrs. Whitmore didn't just handle the arrangements professionally, she'd said. She made sure I felt supported and understood during the worst week of my life. Similar testimonials had continued throughout the evening, creating a powerful testament to the meaningful work Margaret had built, and I was continuing. David had not attended the memorial event, though Tyler and Chloe had mentioned that they'd told him about it. His absence had been appropriate and probably wise, as his presence would have created awkward social dynamics for everyone involved. The second year of business ownership had brought new challenges and opportunities. The COVID-19 pandemic had required rapid adaptation to safety protocols and virtual service options, but it had also demonstrated the essential nature of funeral services and the importance of helping families navigate loss even under difficult circumstances. Our staff had shown remarkable dedication during the pandemic, working long hours to ensure families could honor their loved ones safely, while maintaining the dignity and compassion that defined Whitmore and Associates. The crisis had also reinforced my appreciation for the financial security Margaret's inheritance had provided. Unlike many small businesses that struggled during the economic uncertainty, we'd been able to maintain full employment for our staff and continue serving families, without compromising our standards. Looking ahead, I'd begun developing plans for the third year that included expanded grief counseling services, partnerships with local religious organizations, and possible acquisition of 2 smaller funeral homes in neighboring communities. The 5-year business plan I'd presented to our advisory board had been ambitious but achievable, focusing on sustainable growth that maintained our commitment to community service while building long-term financial stability. On a personal level, I'd also begun dating Robert Castellanos, a widowed professor at Central Connecticut State University, who'd lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier. Our relationship had developed slowly and thoughtfully, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than romantic desperation or financial considerations. Robert had his own successful career in financial security, which meant our relationship was based on genuine compatibility rather than practical necessity. He'd also been widowed rather than divorced, which gave him a different perspective on loss and new beginnings that I'd found refreshing. The children had met Robert gradually and approved of his presence in our lives, though we'd all been careful not to rush into anything that might disrupt the stability we'd worked so hard to establish. As I'd prepared for bed on the evening of Eleanor Martinez's service, I'd reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with David's abandonment at Margaret's funeral 18 months earlier. The woman who'd been left standing beside a grave while her husband walked away to his girlfriend had discovered strength, purpose, and independence she'd never known she possessed. Margaret's inheritance had provided the financial foundation, but the real transformation had come from learning to trust my own judgment, value my own contributions, and build a life centered on meaningful work rather than other people's expectations. David's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. His abandonment had forced me to discover who I was when I wasn't defining myself in relation to someone else's needs and ambitions. The funeral business that had initially seemed like an overwhelming responsibility had become a source of genuine satisfaction and community connection. Helping families navigate grief while honoring their loved ones' lives felt like work worth doing, work that mattered beyond financial rewards. Tyler and Chloe had emerged from their father's abandonment as stronger, more empathetic people who understood the importance of loyalty, character, and treating others with dignity regardless of circumstances. Our family's story had become one of resilience and renewal, rather than loss and betrayal. As I'd turned off the lights in our house on Maple Street, the same house where I'd once lived as David's wife, but now owned as Linda Harper, successful business owner and community leader, I'd felt profound gratitude for the unexpected path my life had taken. Margaret's final gift hadn't just been money and business assets. It had been the opportunity to discover my own capabilities and build something meaningful that would outlast my own lifetime. The boring suburban wife David had abandoned at a funeral had become a woman whose life was defined by purpose, independence, and the satisfaction of work that truly mattered. That transformation, I'd realized, was worth more than any inheritance, no matter how generous. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.